Everyone. Happy Friday. I hope that your week has been a good one, and thank you very much indeed for taking the time to join us today at the end of what is probably a long work week for a particularly exciting session on branding and brand Dominica. So you might be asking the question, why am I joining a session related to branding that's led by Creed? And secondly, why is Creed talking about branding when Dominica already has a strong brand? Authority, together with other agencies in the country, have done incredible work over the past many years to brand Dominica as a destination for ecotourism, for rest and rejuvenation, for relaxation, for really taking advantage of the many blessings that this beautiful country has to offer. We are now talking about branding not just Dominica as a destination, but Dominica as a producer and exporter of products that fit into this broader profile of uniqueness. So why is Creed talking about this? Well, in the broader context of resilience, and not just climate resilience, there are a number of issues that need to be addressed. So not just building back better in the context of infrastructure, but addressing outstanding social issues, as well as taking advantage of tremendous opportunities in the economic growth space. What makes Dominica particularly unique is the abundance of natural resources and other unique assets that the country has, from our abundant fresh water to our rich and fertile soils, to our pristine marine environment, to our forests, to our Kalinago peoples, to the history and traditions of our slave descendant population, and many more. So this richness of the island means that there are traditions that lead to the growth of produce, that lead to the production of products that can and already do have a tremendous impact on the local market, and in some contexts on the regional and international markets. But there's so much more that can be leveraged in terms of generating jobs, in terms of generating revenues, and frankly, in terms of putting Dominica on the map, not just as a destination, but as a producer. So this is clearly of interest to Creed in the context of our work in resilience, but perhaps more importantly, very relevant to two counterpart agencies, so the Ministry for the Blue and Green Economy, as well as the Ministry for Trade and Commerce. With this in mind, over the past few months, Creed has, through the Clinton Climate Initiative, Clinton Global Initiative Network, made contact with an entity by the name of Kindustry, based in Montreal, Canada, that has done tremendous work on branding with a range of players internationally. And we had an initial conversation in February this year at the San Juan meeting of the Clinton Global Initiative, during which I had the pleasure of meeting the partners of Kindustry just as a side conversation to CGI. And in that conversation, I was talking excitedly about all these amazing riches that Dominica has. And Kindustry immediately said, well, we need to talk about branding. And I said, that's interesting, because over the past year or so, Creed has had conversations on and off with the Ministry of Trade and Commerce and the Ministry at that point for Agriculture about how we could take Dominica's products to the next level. And so very much naturally, through a series of conversations and through a lot of, I would say, pro bono time invested by Kindustry, we came to the conclusion that it would make sense to have a series of discussions leading to action in the space of branding Dominica. And again, branding Dominican products. Secondly, over the past several years, through work that has been done by Dexia and by one of our key staff members, along with other entities, we uncovered a fairly comprehensive strategy that had been developed looking at Dominican produce, so not necessarily processed products, but Dominican produce. We all know that Dominica grows the best tagine in the region, as well as many other wonderful things. And we thought, well, look, you know, we've looked at the produce angle in the past. Now let's go further down the value chain to address value addition. When you add value and brand appropriately and market appropriately and make connections into new markets so that you can sell your produce, all of a sudden you see potential really being stimulated to grow the economy. And that's really the context in which we have organized this session. This is a 2-hour discussion. In fact, we've been a bit sneaky and made it about 2 hours and 15 minutes because we really don't want to cut people off as we hopefully get into a very rich conversation of what branding Dominican products could look like what lessons we have to learn, and where individuals who've taken the time and energy to join us in this conversation believe we should be focusing. So this is very much a presentation from our side, but also we will open up to a dialogue with everyone on the call and on the Zoom call, as well as on Facebook, to join us with your ideas and suggestions for how we collectively as a nation, under the leadership of our two ministries as well as CREED, really make this an impactful initiative. So with that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Minister Fidel Grant, as well as Minister Ian Douglas, who are our sponsors and champions within government ministries, and who will say a few words of introduction. So Minister Fidel Grant is the Minister for the Blue and Green Economy, Agriculture and National Food Security. Honorable Minister Grant has tremendous experience in a range of sectors. I believe he's also tried his hands at more creative activities where I think we can we can benefit from in the space of branding. So Minister Grant will say a few words initially, and then we'll pass on to the Honourable Ian Douglas. Over to you, Minister.
Good morning, all. Good morning, Minister Douglas and the other colleagues that are on. This morning I will be brief in order that we have a fruitful discussion. I trust that you all are well in this COVID period, as well as your families. The Ministry of Agriculture is currently working on, along with CREED, to rebrand. And rebrand in the sense that we are looking to promote our local fresh produce, because we have recognized, not just in Dominica, but it has been recognized around the world, that Dominica produce is superior in taste to several of the other countries. So what we will be doing is marketing our fresh produce so that persons who have not tasted can taste, but most important, become aware of not only the nutritional content, but the taste. So what we will be doing in the next couple of months will be working with CREED to put out a branding package along with the Ministry of Trade, along with the Ministry of Tourism. We have a few things that we are working on, and we are hoping that we are able to partner with the supermarkets, the markets, the agro producers, because they play a key role in terms of taking our fresh produce and processing it and bringing it out to other Caribbean countries and even the world by extension. What we are focused on now in the Ministry of Agriculture is ensuring that we have consistent production, because we recognize that in order that we get into any markets, we have to be consistent in our production. So we are working alongside several of the farmers in terms of increasing their acreages so that we have production year-round for crops that we would normally have seasonal production for. In terms of quality, we recognize that post-harvest we have some difficulties in terms of transportation. So we are working alongside the World Bank project currently in terms of getting proper crates and repairing of feeder roads so that the goods being transported from the farm to the market reaches the market in a condition that it's sellable. And that will of course ensure that farmers get a reasonable price for their produce and continues to be profitable. What we will be doing in the next couple of months is going out and meeting with stakeholders. We have already started. We have met with several of the supermarkets. We are hoping to meet with a few more. We have met with a few vendors, because it's a holistic approach where it's not just the farmer, but all the other persons that are involved in the whole process of our fresh produce. So we have met with some of the exporters. They have explained to us some of their challenges in terms of getting the produce out. One of the areas that they have highlighted is the cost of production, cost of transportation. So we are looking at this to have it revised at the present moment, because we recognize that if we're talking about branding and getting our products out, it has to be at a competitive price. So the cost of production, the cost of transportation, and all these things are what we are looking at currently to ensure that we have a product on the market locally, regionally, and internationally, of course, that is affordable to consumers. So this is pretty much it for me in terms of the Ministry of Agriculture. Feel free to ask any questions as we continue to dialogue.
Thank you very much, Minister Grant. We will be having a few additional words from Honourable Minister Ian Douglas in a couple of minutes. But let me just perhaps add a little bit to what Minister Grant has already mentioned. If you take a value chain approach to how products are firstly developed, produced, and then gotten out to market, you will see that there are a number of areas in which Dominica is already doing a fantastic job, and perhaps other areas where additional support is needed. So if we were to take agricultural-based products to begin with, you have your seedlings and your propagation. You move from propagation to growing your produce, to harvesting it, to making sure that it is appropriately stored, be that through cold chain or other facilities. In some instances, you dry it. You then process. In some cases, you do grinding. Other cases, you do addition of particular products or chemicals. But the long and short of it, that is that front end of the value chain only gets so far. You then work on making your products, be it your pepper sauce or your moringa powder or your ground turmeric or your nutmeg. And all of this clearly should happen in facilities that are efficient, cost efficient, as well as efficient in terms of how much they're able to produce based on certain inputs. Clearly that production must be sanitary. Ideally that production should also be quality tested, and so the Bureau of Standards could come in to do spot checks or batch tests to make sure that the products are meeting quality standards that we expect. They are then packaged. Once they're packaged, they're labeled. Once they're labeled, they're repacked into larger boxes, marketed and distributed. In order for that full chain to work, we need to think about the nature of the companies that are doing the work. Is it necessary for every company to have their own full production system, or can they operate in a shared facility? So you buy time, or you operate at certain times in the year related to your harvest cycle, or you purchase time, once a week when you know that you're going to have access to raw materials. But that's only one part of the business cycle. In order for business to be truly commercial, you also need to make sure that you have advisory skills, advisory support, be it in the form of a small business advisor or a coach that's helping you design products that the market needs, that's addressing maybe consumer outreach or even consumer complaints, and that's really helping think about this as a business and not just as a cottage industry. So that's the second piece. And then, of course, the third piece, which facilitates business and is frankly critical to business, is access to capital, access to finance. And typically when you are seeking access to finance, a lender, a bank will say, show me your 2-3 years of business history and your financial statements. Show me your business plan. Show me, your market knowledge and your market access research. So you'll be asked a lot of things. I believe in Dominica we have tremendous potential in our small businesses that are dealing with some part of this value chain. We often hear that businesses know where they're going, but if you ask the question of how much detail can they provide in financial statements, how much detail can they provide in business planning, that then becomes a bottleneck, and as a result you can't access financing. And when you can't access financing, you can't grow. You can't retain the accountant that you need to help you with your business plan and with your audits. You can't retain the strategy firm to help you with your business planning. And so you end up in this vicious cycle of having tremendous potential and producing a certain amount of product, but never really being able to achieve your full potential. And in that regard, it's really critical that we tie the work of the Ministry of Agriculture, the work of Dexia, and the work of other entities that deal with this upstream portion of the value chain to the downstream cycle, from quality control to marketing, to market access, through distribution chains, through warehousing, through cold chain, supply chain, even to logistics and shipping. And so the entire space of developing Dominica's products has to be looked at in synergy, in tandem. Otherwise, there is a great chance that we brand wonderful products, but we don't have sufficient raw materials on the upstream or input side, and we don't have sufficient quality control, marketing, packaging, and distribution on the downstream side. And then you get a bottleneck in the middle, and as a result, you can't get financing and businesses can't grow. So in taking this holistic approach, I think various points of the value chain need to be addressed at the same time. Our focus today is obviously on branding, but we understand that to unlock the full value chain, multiple additional interventions are required. So with those few words, I am hoping that I can pass on to the Honorable Ian Douglas if he has joined us. I see Honorable Douglas, Ministry of Trade and Commerce.
Hi, Pep. Minister Douglas's secretary did sign him on, but he's actually on his way in. So I don't know if you want to fill the space or let Nadia come in. I'm not sure, but he is on his way into the session.
Fantastic. So my suggestion would be if Nadia Paquette-Ansel, Creed's agricultural specialist, could maybe say a few words of how today's session will unfold. We can then pass on to Minister Douglas to say his words of introduction and then dive straight into the presentations. Nadia, could I pass to you?
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to definitely recognize the presence of Honorable Fidel Grant, who's gracing us here today, Minister of Blue and Green Economy, Agriculture, and National Food Security. And I'm also trusting that the Minister, Honorable Ian Douglas, joins us shortly. We also have about 59 persons and counting, so I'm grateful for this participation this morning. I would also like to acknowledge the presence of the permanent secretaries who have joined us today, other ministers, heads of departments from various government entities, the staff of Creed, the media, the entrepreneurs, the private sector, of course. And I would also like to acknowledge our facilitators who are here with us this morning from both Kindustry and Windward's Commodities. We're grateful that you have graced us with your presence and you're here to facilitate this session. Branding definitely is a key topic that has triggered and sparked interest across the globe. It's very much pivotal to us. It's beyond just the marketing practice of defining an entity's logo or a design that belongs to a company, but it's a lot more work that requires distinguishing the brand or allowing the brand to distinguish the company's products and services. On this pretext, I would like to ignite this session. I believe it's a critical, pivotal brainstorming session, and I think it's just one of its kind of many that will follow through. And we will receive some interesting, intriguing presentations from both Kindustry and Windwards, which will spark our interest in terms of how do we move forward in terms of branding the space, the agricultural space, agro-processing industry, and critically some of the components of the nutraceutical industry. We will receive presentations from Candice Olives and Rob Hopingham. Rob, I hope I did justice to your surname. And of course, Chris Dochetti out of Windward Commodities. We trust that the persons who are here with us will be participating throughout this process and will trigger questions and answers either through the chat or by raising your hands, as Karen would have alluded to earlier on. And that session, of course, will be facilitated or chaired by Karen Mehi, our communications specialist. So without further ado, I'm intrigued and excited to have this session because I'm trusting that it's very much alive and participative. We definitely want to hear from the persons who are here with us today as we take the branding initiative forward. So again, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our facilitators. And Karen, I will pass over to you as you highlight who our facilitators are. So we do have from Kindustry, Candice Olives. And as I said earlier on, we also have Rob Hopingham. Rob has had experience as a corporate lawyer, management consultant, and retail executive for a global fashion brand. Rob funded and the branding and advisory strategy for Kindustry, a company which works with global brands and countries over the world. Karen is sharing her screen, so I'll allow her to do so.
And this is Rob.
Thank you so much, Karen.
It took a little time, I'm sorry, but this is Rob. And Nadia, you may proceed to the next.
Thank you again. Yes, so as I continue, Kindustry is a company that works with global brands, organizations, and countries on where they go next to achieve growth or manage disruption. Social impact, purpose, cultural relevance are important threads that run through Kindustry's work. Rom, as I indicated earlier on, is the founder and the CEO of Kindustry. Candice Olives is the head of brand and creative partner of Kindustry. Candice joined Kindustry in 2011 and has been advising over 30 brands, including some of the world's largest corporations, NGOs, foundations, and countries at a global level. Some of these include L'Oreal and Four Seasons. Candice has also developed communications for the United Nations, Clinton Global Initiative, 60 Minutes, among others. Candice brings a modern and thoughtful lens to all of the brand work she does across industries. Chris Dochetti is the managing director of Windward Commodities, an international group with investments in global agricultural supply chains and food brands across the Caribbean, Southern Africa, and the Pacific. He's a non-executive director of the Caribbean Council and chairman of the West Indies Sugar and Trading Company, Barbados. He has global blue chip experience and Shell International at a senior level. Chris believes passionately in the potential for Caribbean and other small island states to improve food security and livelihoods by producing more and importing less. Without, as I've introduced the facilitators, Chair, I'm not sure if our Honorable Minister has joined us.
I am just checking to see.
Yes,
Wonderful.
Okay, very much
Welcome.
so. Yes, I'll allow the Honorable Minister to grace us with some brief remarks, and post the same, we will delve into the presentations by Kindustry. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nadia, and welcome, Minister Douglas. We're very pleased that you are able to join us. Please, I'd like to hand over to you to provide a few words of introduction. We have already introduced you, but I will just make sure that your full title is covered again. So Minister Ian Douglas is the Minister for Trade, Commerce, Entrepreneurship, Innovation, Business, and Export Development. He has an incredible background and expertise in a number of sectors, and I know brings a great vision to his new ministry. So over to you, Minister Douglas.
Okay, thank you very much. And thanks for inviting me to this forum. It's a pleasure for me to be here, particularly in my new portfolio, which is trade, commerce, entrepreneurship, innovation, business and export development. Really, this is an issue that we have been grappling with even before this whole COVID pandemic. And I would say, going back to Hurricane Maria, when I first came to the Ministry of Trade some years ago, one thing that I wanted to concentrate on really is branding in the marketplace, especially in the regional marketplace, because traditionally we've had goods, items, particularly stuff like fresh produce and maybe to a lesser extent value-added products leaving our shores, but not really in an organized, strategic focus kind of way. It's just like almost everybody doing their own thing. You have the hucksters and the small traders doing their own thing, and the manufacturers trying to find their way. But there's not been a collaborative, collective effort to market Dominican produce, be it fresh, raw material, raw produce, or value-added products. And I feel that we have a niche. I think it's possible, especially I'm even more convinced now since the global pandemic and the international supply chains being interrupted. This potential for Dominica to expand its markets have become even more pronounced in that respect. So that's why I was very excited and I was very happy when I was invited to this forum. Perhaps recently, maybe as recent as a couple of years ago, 1 or 2 years ago, the Dominica Export-Import Agency, DEXIA, have also tried to do some kind of branding, especially as it relates to fresh produce. I think we will try to come up with a brand and a logo, eat well, live young, or live long, eat well, something to that effect, so that we could become more competitive in the marketplace. And so our customers out there would be able to more readily identify Dominican produce, especially fresh produce. Because we hear it every day from our customers that Dominica has some of the best fresh produce on the regional markets in places like Guadeloupe, Antigua, St. Martin, the US Virgin Islands. But sometimes our packaging leaves a lot to be desired. The way that our produce, our fruit is transported, the way that it reaches the market, sometimes put us out of the competition, although most times we have a more superior product on the market. So all of those issues we've been trying to work with. Also to, through DEXIA again and through the pack houses, where we just established 2 multi-purpose pack houses, so that we could try to deal with some of those issues, try to bring all of the challenges together under one roof, and try to deal with them, from packaging our fresh produce for export to even pursuing value added. So taking the raw pepper and converting it into pepper mash to support the pepper sauce industry, because we have a number of entrepreneurs in the pepper sauce industry in Dominica right now. And other things we've been working with, like dashing chunks and stuff, because at points of the year during the season, then there's sometimes a surplus of particular fresh produce on the market. And so we try to become innovative and see how we can add some value to the excess and try to put it out there on the market, sometimes on the local market, as in the case of dashing chunks. And also, we've also been trying to experiment with Irish potatoes, with white potatoes, which last year, I believe, or the year before, we had a good foray into the market, and the local supermarkets worked with us very well to the benefit of the farmers. And so we're looking to see if we could even increase our local production of items like white potatoes, and probably expand the offerings, not just to have the potatoes sold in the market, but perhaps convert it to chips that could be absorbed by the hotels, those that are established on island and those to come. So these are some of the ideas we've been touring with, and I hope that through this forum we could probably delve more deeply into those issues and come up with some real solutions, not just having some academic intellectual discourse and generating a paper that will sit on our shelves, but really giving us some tangible suggestions, advice, recommendations that we could filter down into the field, and we could give the farmers of Dominica, who are really on the front line, some serious hope, because there is tremendous potential for generating revenue, for generating income. Some of them, that's what they depend on. They feed their families, they pay their mortgages. That's how they live. So whatever we discuss here that can redound to the benefit of the farmers who make up rural Dominica, really. I mean, and especially now in light of COVID-19, the tourism industry it is going to be under pressure for some time, the short to medium term. So I think the agricultural industry in general holds tremendous promise. And so this is why I am so very interested in our discussion this morning. So that's just some of the ideas and thoughts that I wanted to throw out for us to mull over as we discuss those issues.
Thank you very much indeed, Honourable Minister Douglas, and thank you also to Minister Grant for your words of introduction. Mr. Douglas, I think you hold our feet to the fire. This is not to be a talk which leads to a report that sits on shelves. I think if we look at the mix of individuals in the audience, I'm seeing some entrepreneurs, I'm seeing some people who are coming from the business sector. So we hope that this will be the beginning, not just of a conversation, but of action to help add to the work that's already been done and the work that many farmers and producers are already putting sweat and blood into. So let us add to it. Let's see how we can drive the agenda forward and really make Dominica's products shine. So without further ado, after these words of introduction, I would like to pass on to Rob and Candice from Kindustry for the first of 3 sessions. This session will focus on the nuts and bolts of branding with a series of case studies. So over to you, Rob and Candice.
Thank you, Pep. I hope everyone can hear me. First and foremost, I want to wish all of you and your family and loved ones well, and I hope that everyone is healthy. These are trying times and very interesting times for brands, to be completely honest with you. I want to first say how honored we are to be part of this discussion and recognize the Honorable Minister Grant and Minister Douglas as well as distinguished attendees. We look forward to this being, the first sort of volley in a discussion that leads towards tangible solutions as well. So I would echo the comments, the previous comments. I would say that we are actually quite excited to be talking about this as it relates to Dominica, because we do feel in a lot of ways that Dominica represents the country of the future. It embodies a spirit of a progressive spirit, resilient spirit, natural resources, and people that we've come close to over the short term that seem really inspired by all of the possibilities that Dominica holds. And we do want to focus this conversation on branding. I just would make a quick comment when there was a few mentions of pepper sauce, and I'm up in Canada. I happen to be a lover of pepper sauce, and I have so many different kinds in my house, and there's specialty stores that I go to all the time to access them. And the interesting thing is when you go to these stores, you can look at a wall and there's sometimes up to 200 different pepper sauces. And the key question becomes, why Dominica's pepper sauce, or why the brand from Dominica? And I think that's where this idea of branding becomes so important. So in this presentation and the subsequent presentation, we are going to be talking about what a brand is, because I think we all know a brand when we see it, but not necessarily what they're made of and how they're constructed. We want to talk to you a little bit about also where brands are going next. We're living in very disruptive times. It's having a massive impact on how brands are reorganizing and re-expressing themselves to the world. We'll look at a little case study of something that we've done, just to give you a sense of how a brand is not just built, from an academic point of view, but how it actually reaches market. And then in a subsequent presentation, we will talk about country branding and country of origin branding, which is really important for us to think about as it relates to Dominica. Dominica being a country that is the world's best kept secret in some ways. And everyone seems to be frustrated by the fact that our fruit tastes better than everyone else's, but no one knows about it. But the truth is there's a massive opportunity there to think about the Dominica brand, and also how it relates to export brands, because there is a really interesting dance that happens between country of origin brands and export brands. They are symbiotic and they're mutually supportive, and we can't really understand one without understanding the other. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about the premium nutraceutical sector and what's possible in terms of maybe thinking about branding this sector. And I know it's going to bring up a lot of questions about how this relates to agriculture in general, but I thought it would be interesting to focus a deep dive on that. It's something we can get our heads around fairly easy, and it does represent a more of a value add type of brand export than perhaps some of the natural resources that we were speaking of before. So before we get into the branding part, I would just ask Candace to advance the slides, and we'll just give you a brief background. I think Nadia, you did a wonderful job, even of trying to pronounce my name. It's Hoppenheim, actually, and there's only parts of Europe that seem to get it right. But in any case, thank you for that introduction. It was very kind and generous. I did want to kind of just go over a little bit about what Kindustry is. We're not sort of an ad agency per se. We're an advisory, and we're thought partners with executives and government officials on how things move forward in the brand space, the brand strategy space, and also in communications. So, you know, Kindustry is an advisory group. We're based out of Montreal, and we work with global brands and NGOs and countries and where they go next through strategy, branding, and social impact. And primarily, we work through three key pillars. The first pillar is Kindustry brand architecture, and this is really the building blocks of a brand, the construct of a brand. There is an architecture to it. It's not an ethereal thing. There is really a method to the madness, and we do that a lot with brands, mostly on where they go next. So some have plateaued, or some have to reinvent, or some have to start from scratch. We also have a pillar called Kindustry culture, and this is a pillar where we shine light on important social and cultural issues through content development, events, and other types of communications. For example, we've worked recently with 60 Minutes on the new construct for their global summit. So what is 60 Minutes, the show, the CBS show in the United States, what does that look like as a formal summit, a physical summit, and how does that translate? As far as content and is concerned, I think we work a lot on docuseries as well, original docuseries. We've actually just been down to Cuba a while ago and are looking to do a series on Cuban contemporary artists. So this is the type of work that we're doing. Of course, in all of these things, there's a strong element of social impact and social issues. And finally, Kindustry Venture. This is where we're building and incubating and generating businesses that live at the intersection of profit and the greater good. And we've just launched one, a fashion brand actually in California, and we're in the process of developing a skincare brand as we speak. So one thing I wanted to mention quickly is that we do work by bringing multiple sectors together. So we're very comfortable with bringing the private sectors together with the public sector, as well as NGOs, youth groups, all kinds of other key stakeholders. It's a very important part of our process. It's reflected in some of the work that you see on this page. The first piece is Caribbean 2.0, where we've been working with the Caribbean Tourism Organization, the Caribbean Hotel and Tourism Association, as well as with the Clinton Foundation and multiple other stakeholders, bringing together public sector and private sector to think about a progressive, sustainable, and resilient brand and tourism platform for the region. And this is in response to the disruption that's happened from an environmental point of view on the tourism industry over the last number of years. We work closely with Clinton Foundation, Clinton Global Initiative, where we met PEP originally, and where we've been working primarily on post-disaster recovery in the Caribbean and monitoring and preparing sessions in those meetings. We work also with the United Nations and presently are advising them on strategic communications on their UN 75. It's their 75th anniversary. We're conducting or helping them conduct a global listening program, the most widely, I think, disseminated listening program around the world to help inform the future vision of the United Nations at this critical time. Interestingly enough, one of the things that we've been doing recently is working with a group called Loop in the Caribbean and trying to use their platform to disseminate survey materials to as many people in the Caribbean as possible. And finally, just a quick sample of our work. Again, you'll see on this page a combination of sort of global brands. There's a strong concentration in beauty, fashion, art, tourism, hospitality, etc. So high sensibility type of brands like Four Seasons and MAC Cosmetics, Sotheby's Auction House, Sephora, etc. And I think the idea is that we sort of work at the intersection of sort of global issues and profound issues, and also consumer-facing brands, and in some cases, best in class. So I'm going to pass it over to Candace, who's going to take us through some of the nuts and bolts of branding. And again, I think just in the spirit of the objective of this meeting, it would be great if people do have questions and want to stop and disrupt us. We're happy to skate a little bit and move laterally if there are questions, and if not, we can hold them to the end and have a fruitful discussion.
Thank you very much, Rob, and everyone. Again, very, very happy to be here, and thank you all for having us and listening to this presentation. So now that you have a little bit of a better idea about what industry is and our branding expertise, we wanted to take you through a little bit of our thinking in terms of what is a brand, how do we build one, and how it comes to life through a specific case study. So let's dive in. What is a brand? And again, I'm not going to spend too much time because we all know this, but we wanted to just make sure that we were aligned. So brand is a covenant, a bond between an organization and its community. And the way we define community is not only its customers, but also its employee and suppliers. It is a measure of trust. So for example, when we think about Nike, we don't think about just the logo, but Nike is the aggregation of all of the things that, you know, it does, which gives it meaning. The second thing to understand about a brand is that it is in constant evolution and needs to be continuously culturally relevant or it can die. And a perfect example in the industry, in the lingerie industry, is Victoria's Secret versus Rihanna's Fenty. So Victoria's Secret, for example, did not really adapt to the cultural evolution of what beauty means today. Whereas on the other hand, Rihanna really based her brand on this idea of more diversity and inclusivity, and is partly, you know, the cause of her success today. So all that to say that, you know, this is what a brand is, and there is a method to the madness, or an architecture that helps to shape a brand and create a platform on which it can grow. So how do we build a brand? This is a proprietary method or methodology that we've been using with all of our clients, whether there are startups, global companies, regions of the world, or even people for that matter. So here's the science to building a brand. It's basically, as you can see, 3 tiers. Tier number 1 is the brand strategy, which includes customer archetypes. So who do we want to target and how do we define them? Second pillar here is competitive positioning and differentiation. So how is a brand differentiated from its competitors? Its mission, what is the ROI and the desired impact? Then we get into the second tier, which is the brand essence and the identity. The vision is really the heart of everything here. The vision is a brand's raison d'être, or its reason for existing. So we did a lot of work with the auction house Sotheby's, and we described it, for example, as merchants of the extraordinary. So there's a little bit of poetry here. It's really what the brand stands for, its philosophy. Then we have the promise and the personality. The promise is a statement about what a brand promises and will continuously deliver to its constituencies. An example is Volvo, and Volvo stands for safety. And if a brand breaks that promise, then it also breaks trust that it has with its customers, and which is why it is very important. Finally, personality. We have to think about brands as people, and as people, they have personality traits. For example, MAC Cosmetics, which is a makeup brand, was the personality traits were defiantly human and widely artistic. And then finally, the third tier here are brand applications. Brand applications are all of the concrete things that make a brand alive. So you have brand voice and narrative. You could have logo design, packaging, strategic partnerships, and so on. So now that we know what a brand is, how to build one, and how to give it a global recognition, let's look at a real life example. This is Nana de Gaspé. Nana de Gaspé is a mask, so a luxury brand based on their products are anti-aging masks. It's a brand that we created from scratch, and we launched at Selfridges, which is a retailer, luxury retailer in the UK. So here's some narrative just to start putting you into this universe, The Art of Maskology. Welcome to the world of skin seduction, where wearable technology meets luxury cosmetics. So we're reinventing a category here. And I'm gonna go through it rather quickly, but the idea, the foundations that I just presented earlier, that kind of like map, this is how now it translates. So you always need to start with those foundations. So here, vision, promise, personality, which are really the compass that define the brand. In this specific example, the idea was to create a modern experience for ancient beauty rituals and women's best-kept secrets. So here's how it came to life in terms of the collection, the packaging, the narrative, the product development, including some, here it's hard to see on the packaging, but we called it a library of skin seduction. So again, on that idea of mystery and secret and so on. All the sachets had different kind of look and feel and identity, but overall it is all laddering back up to those foundations that we just reviewed. Again, here's how it cascades now to asset creation with kiosk design, website design, social media, and the idea is that the universe is tight all around. And finally, how now it also translates into brand launch. So the actualization of a brand through press, communications, store, and here in that particular case, the brand was launched in the world's most exclusive retailers, pardon me. So why did we wanted to show you this case specifically is because we want to communicate the fact that it is extremely important to build strong foundations in order to create a brand, to launch it, and for it to be successful, but also for it to have the ability to break through in different parts of the world. And it's also important to have a holistic approach to building a brand.
Thanks, Candice. I would just jump in and add a little bit to that. So that's an example of a brand that was built and launched. And we wanted to show you an example of not just a global brand that we're starting with, but startup brands and how you're able to sort of build it from the foundations and the architecture up through to launch. That was built and launched a few years ago. And since then, I think it's interesting for us to all be aware of the context in which we live. We talked about brands needing to evolve, and brands always need to evolve. We see brands as living, breathing things. It's not just a snapshot in time, like a balance sheet would be, for example. So I think that it's interesting for us to understand the context of the times we're living in today, because they're having a massive impact on how brands are acting and reacting. And also rethinking what they're all about. Today, what we're dealing with is an environment of revolutions, and they're happening with greater frequency and ferocity. I think everyone feels that we've sort of hit a tipping point after Black Lives Matter, but the truth is Black Lives Matter works in conjunction with COVID and the scenario around COVID and people's psychology around COVID. And then prior to that, the Me Too revolution and gender rights as well, LGBTQ and gun control. And there's just a whole bunch of issues and revolutions and shifting paradigms from the point of view of consumers that are now forcing organizations and brands to rethink exactly what they're all about and how they're dealing with not just their products and the integrity of their products, but how they're dealing with their employees and their stakeholder groups and their larger communities. I think what we're advising brands that we've been working on with them for the last little while, if you can go back, Candice, is really to develop a moral compass. And I think without a moral compass, brands are at risk. So the brand that we spoke to about Nanette de Gaspé, this was more of a pure play cosmetic brand, niche luxury that we're able to help successfully launch. But today, and the last few years, we've really been working with clients on developing this moral compass, this other level of sort of, if you want to call it self-actualization and understanding and self-awareness. And what we can see in this environment today is that you have even the biggest companies in the world are not immune or inoculated from the risk of being without a moral compass. Brands like Facebook, for example, are facing tremendous pressure from advertisers who are boycotting in droves, and also from the inside, from employees who are protesting and want to change in in terms of the moral identity of the business. So this is something that's extremely relevant today. And as we think about branding and branding Dominica's exports, this is a layer that we have to be very, very concerned with and aware of. What we do and the way forward and the way we advise brands is by helping them understand the need to build what we call a human-centric organization. So a human-centric organization actually puts people at the center of decisions, growth, and social, economic, and environmental impact. And this is key. And we see this as a trinity of important pillars. And the first one is purpose. And I think a lot of us are hearing a lot about, purpose-driven organizations. Purpose is really the inspiration. You have to think of an organization as being bound or being sort of looking up to a myth or almost a religion. And I think it's this purpose that helps everyone who's connected with that brand have a more purposeful experience with it. And that's what all these stakeholders are asking for more and more. So as we look at brands, actually, there's a vision and there's a promise, but actually what is its purpose? And I think that's a key piece. The culture is another key piece. The culture is really the engine of the organization. And this is the place where the values and principles of the organization are articulated and expressed. And it's through this culture that this brand grows and this brand evolves. And finally, community. We talk a lot about community, and a lot of brands don't even understand what community means. And initially, community meant the community of customers, and now it's a community of employees. But we're trying to, and what we've been doing with brands for the last number of years, is have them understand that they have to understand their community as a community of communities. It's not just one community. There's a lot of touch points that a brand and organization has, not just with their employees, not just with their customers, not just with their suppliers, but also with the local communities in which they operate. And so they have to be conscious of the fact that these are the people they need to keep empowering as the brand evolves and grows. So that's just a snapshot of kind of where brands are going next. This is an entire presentation of 2 hours on its own, but we thought we wanted to kind of represent this because as we're looking to the opportunity for Dominica, it's, we have, the brand exports, there's been some great work that's been done. Now there's a really big opportunity for value add brand exports, and we have to be conscious of kind of where the world is moving at the same time. The wonderful thing is that Dominica and what it stands for really speaks to a lot of these issues of purpose and community and culture. So we're actually well positioned to take advantage of this, I wouldn't call it a trend, but this complete shift in where organizations are moving today. With that, we would just end the first part of that presentation, and if anyone has any questions or anyone wants to have any discussion, we would be very pleased to do so.
Thank you very much, Candice and Rob. Again, this is the first of 3 presentations, so I hope no one thinks that we're over yet. Please do feel free to raise your hand with any questions. But what I'll just say is that I think what Candice and Rob have done is painted, the top level view, which is quite inspirational about what can be, what brands mean. I think you're absolutely right that we're operating in a complex mix right now, right? So Black Lives Matter, COVID, etc. And so nothing that we do now can avoid this shift that is happening globally. It's not a one-off. It's not, well, that will pass. I think we're at a point where people are having existential issues at a global scale, not on a national scale, which I would say is fairly unprecedented. We might have to go back to the 60s to look at the Vietnam War and shifts for the last major challenge. So I think this gives us a top level view. Our next presentation, which will come from Chris Dorchetti, who's the Managing Director of Windward Commodities, goes from the global to the regional. And then the third presentation will come back to Kindustry to focus on Dominica. So zooming in an upside down pyramid. Are there any questions from the floor or anything that I may have missed with raised hands, Karen, or are we good to move to the next discussion?
You're good to move to the next discussion, Pat.
Okay, just one small question, Dr. Badwell, one small question.
Hi, Dr. Douglas, how are you?
Pretty good, pretty good. Just very briefly, the question of, I'm clear on purpose as inspiration, but culture as engine. Just say a few words on that so it is clear. Culture as engine. I'm talking about the presenter that spoke just before you, Dr. Badwell. Thank you.
Please go ahead, Rod.
Sure, it's a great question. I mean, the culture is really the element that helps a brand and organization remain innovative, evolving, and it's according to certain principles and values that have been set out and shared and expressed and adopted by all people who are involved with the organization. So we see it as this engine of progress in some ways. I think what, you know, the example that Candice gave before about Victoria's Secret versus Fenty, which is a newer lingerie brand, is that, you know, the culture of Victoria's Secret was antiquated. It didn't mirror where the world's culture was going, where the zeitgeist was going, where shifts in value were going into a more diverse and an inclusive world. And I think that a culture is something that is developed over time, but it's rooted in very strong principles, and it really allows those organizations to optimize their full potential.
Thank you, appreciate that.
Thank you for the question, Dr. Douglas, and for your response, Rob. I see a message in the chat here, essentially agreeing to what Candice has talked about in the context of having a strong foundation being critical, and this tying strongly into the concept of community. We have to have the people of Dominica involved. Couldn't agree more. Thank you. So with that, over to you, Chris.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much indeed to Creed for asking me to speak. My name is Chris Doherty. I'm the Managing Director of Windward Commodities. We're based in the UK and the Caribbean, and with an office in Zimbabwe and Southern Africa. I'm here to talk about the commercial realities of branding and how it can, in very practical terms, add value. A very brief introduction to Windward. We have two main trading divisions. We have a joint venture with the Barbados government, which we'll be talking about later, in the sugar industry, which exports branded sugar into the UK, EU, US and Caribbean markets as a premium product. We're a social enterprise, so we take a lot of that added value and give it back downstream to farmers and producers. The other main division is in honey. We source and process honey in Zimbabwe and Zambia and Tanzania and export it both around the region and into primarily the UK market. Again, a social enterprise, and the whole purpose of what we do is to create brands in order to create additional value at the farmer end of the equation. We also have a consulting and advisory arm, which is a little bit wider in terms of, again, adding value to commodities and connecting producers to consumer markets directly. It's all the way from, we were instrumental in setting up Sol. My background, I used to work for Shell, and so I was part of the buyout of Shell companies in the Caribbean some time ago. We created the Sol brand around the region. We created global brands, again, in another commodity category, aluminium, low carbon aluminium for Rio Tinto, rice in Nigeria. We had a coffee brand in Mexico, which we recently sold to Econ, which is one of these large trading conglomerates you've never heard of, but it's absolutely enormous. But the basis of everything that we do, which is primarily focused on small island developing states in the Caribbean and Pacific and agriculture in Southern Africa, is adding value to basic commodities and making sure that the added value which is created through processing and branding and supply chain management goes back to producers and farmers. The problem we have in commodity supply chains, and anyone who's been in the banana or sugar industry in the Caribbean over the last 20 years.
You're talking now, but I don't hear nothing.
You're still not hearing?
Mm-mm.
On the phone, you're talking to me, you're doing it?
On the phone. I'm gonna put you off. Oh, well.
Sorry.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. Could you please all make sure that you're on mute? Thank you very much. Please go ahead, Chris. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So anyone who's been in the sugar or banana industries in the Caribbean will know that we progressively had less and less of the value of the product remitted to farmers and producers over the last 20 to 40 years. And regardless of the category, whether it's sugar or bananas or cocoa, the value that farmers receive as a percentage of the end sale value has halved in the last 40 years. And it's pretty consistent. The statistics are relatively difficult to find, but it's pretty much consistent across products, across services, and there's a number of reasons for it, but the primary reason that producers are getting less and less of the value of commodities is this chart here, which shows the primary problem with global food supply chains, which is that there are millions and millions of consumers at the top, there are millions and millions of farms at the bottom, and increasingly a very, very small number of agribusinesses are concentrated in the middle with enormous purchasing power. There's around 100 companies globally account for something like 73% of all food sales. And that ranges from retailers like Walmart, Tesco's, Ahold, Aldi. In the Caribbean, someone like Massey has enormous purchasing power, through to massive grain traders like Cargill, large manufacturers like Nestle, Unilever in the Caribbean, people like Grace Kennedy. And that bottleneck means that producers have been squeezed more and more so that buyers can get better and better prices. And unless you can persuade the end consumer that your product is better in some way, and this comes back to exactly what Rob was talking about earlier in terms of branding. If you can't find a compelling reason for consumers to want to pay more for produce from Dominica, which we know is fabulous, we know it's the best in the world, but they do not necessarily know that yet, it's incredibly difficult to persuade those buyers who control the global food chain, and whether that's regional and you're talking to a Massey buyer in Barbados or Trinidad, or whether that is international, you go to Bentonville and sit in front of a Walmart buyer, which I have done, and it's not a very pleasant experience. I wouldn't recommend it. You have to have an incredibly good reason why that person who has enormous purchasing power, they can make or break a brand in a second, why that person is going to choose Dominica produce over any other in the world. It's critically important. The other problem we have is that all of that issue in terms of buyer concentration has been mitigated over the last 20 to 30 years by certification. Fair trade, organic, Rainforest Alliance. The problem is that as certification marks have proliferated, there are, I think, currently, I believe, 192 separate stamps which are put on various products. As they've proliferated, consumers have become confused. Is fair trade better than Rainforest Alliance? What is CO2 neutral? What does Green Seal mean? What is RTRS? Is leaf good or is leaf bad? And the other issue is it's very generic. So whilst fair trade is a great initiative, and I like it very much, we do an awful lot with fair trade with our own brands, it is generic. So if you are a Dominica banana producer and you're sending your bananas to Sainsbury's in the UK, you end up on the shelf as a fair trade banana alongside a Costa Rican banana, which is also fair trade, but is cheaper because Costa Rica has enormous industrial banana farms. And it's very difficult for consumers to differentiate between a Dominica banana and a Costa Rican banana, which is why country of origin branding and branding on a more specific level is becoming more and more important. As is, the other issue there is that increasingly manufacturers like Nestle, a big announcement recently, and supermarkets are getting rid of these certification marks in favor of their own ethical standards, which are, of course, far less stringent than people like Fair Trade or Rainforest Alliance. So certification is less valuable than it used to be. It still has value, but you need to take control to an extent of your own destiny. The other opportunity, and obviously we deal in commodities, so this is critical, is that product similarity is not a barrier to branding. A lot of people believe that just because one piece of timber is very similar to another, you can't brand it. It's simply not true. I think the best example is water. Everyone knows it. Tap water on average globally has a cost of 0.002 US cents per litre. You buy that same water, which is pretty much 99.9% identical, in a plastic bottle of Fiji water or Perrier or Evian for $2 a litre, with a vastly increased carbon footprint. There was a great study recently from New York, which tested tap water in New York against bottled water, and it found actually that tap water was almost all of the time better for you than bottled mineral water. Something to think about when you next pick up a bottle of mineral water from a kiosk in New York. The same is true of salt, 76 cents per kilo. You brand it as Malden or Hallamon, $24 a kilo. Sugar, we pay just over $1,000 US for the sugar we buy. The world price of sugar is $320. You brand it, you can afford to pay farmers, producers, processors more. But branding isn't just about branding. All this chart shows is that branding allows you to shorten your supply chains, and that is where the value lies. It's not in branding itself per se. A brand without any practical sort of application of the brand on packaging, as a sale, as revenue, is just a nice picture on a piece of paper. In a traditional bulk commodity model, if you're selling bananas, for example, typically what happens is the farmer delivers the bananas. There may be some quality control, and it is put on a ship, and you're paid for the bananas, and that's fine. But as we've seen, the value of that has gone down very substantially. It's halved over the last 20 to 30 years. And the people who make the money are the traders who buy it, the processors who process it, and the customers, the supermarkets who sell it to the end consumer. What we look at doing is to take more control. So you produce the stuff, you ship it yourself, you own it. You process or distribute it yourself, and you sell direct to the end customer, whether it's a manufacturer or a supermarket. And that gives you much more control, and it gives you much, much, much more value. It is, of course, much more expensive, much more risky, but it is the way the world is going. And it is the way that you create value from brands. It's by making sure you control more of the supply chain. And I just wanted to illustrate that point with a very short case study about what we've done with Barbados sugar. The problem with Barbados sugar, which I'm illustrating here, is exactly the same as the problem with all Caribbean agriculture, which is that the Caribbean is very small and it lacks the economies of scale that larger producers have. The best statistic is, for me, is that the entire island of Barbados is 1/10 of the size of the average sugar plantation in Brazil. So a single Brazilian plantation is 10 times the size of Barbados. Not a Barbados farm, the entire island. I used to live in the northeast of Brazil, and you can drive for hours without seeing anyone else. And what that means is that, and the same is true of producing sweet potatoes or producing bananas. Quite apart from anything else, the cost of labor in Barbados, Dominica, is much higher than that in Brazil or Thailand, and quite rightly so. There's unionization, there are benefits, there's a higher standard of living. And that means that it's very difficult to become price competitive in the global market as a small island. You have to find a niche and you have to stick to that niche and you have to add value to your products to survive. And what this is showing is that the problem for Barbados Sugar is that after EU subsidies were withdrawn in 2008, the world price was below the cost of production. And that has produced a $5 million annual gap between the cost of production and the revenue that the industry was getting. So back in 2008, we looked at revenues going off a cliff and said, okay, we need to do something about this. And what we did is we developed a single origin brand for Barbados Sugar, which for the packaging on the left, it's under the brand Plantation Reserve. The packaging on the left is for the UK, which is rather subdued. In the Caribbean, where we sell in a number of markets, and obviously particularly Barbados, it's a much brighter. You need sunglasses to look at the product, which is exactly how we wanted it. And that brings me to another point. It's impossible to create a brand and simply sell one product. Supermarkets aren't interested in just one bag of Barbados sugar, one type of sugar. It costs them as much to put one product on a shelf as it costs them to put 20 products on a shelf. So if you go to Tesco's or you go to Walmart, and I speak from bitter experience, with one bag of Barbados sugar and say, guys, what do you think? They'll say no, thank you, but we have suppliers already who can provide us with all these products which our consumers need. So you need icing sugar, you need dark demerara sugar, you need sachets, you need artificial sweetener, you need stevia, you need the lot. And that also helps you create volume because you need a mix of low price, high volume items and high price, low volume items which create your margin. So you also need to, you can't just create a brand, you also have to create a whole sort of portfolio of products and pricing and supply chains to manage that underneath. The other thing I think which it's worth mentioning is that, and it was mentioned by a couple of people before, it is that quality and reliability and consistency of supply is utterly critical. A brand is only as good as its supply chain. You can have the best brand in the world, but if you run out, and we have it on occasion run out, you get kicked out. So we don't run out anymore. If you don't have ISO 22000 certification, you can't get into a supermarket. So if you can't do that onshore in Dominica, in Barbados, you outsource it to somebody who can do it when you ship it to the UK or the US, which is exactly what we do. So it's not just about packaging the portfolio, it's about the supply chain, and it's about the pricing that is associated with it. The other thing, and it's critically important for origin-based brands, is that most commodities and most stuff that we produce in the Caribbean is an ingredient. So if you're creating a retail brand, which you're going to put on the shelf, you also need to create an ingredient brand. So we created a little stamp, sort of like Intel Inside, for sugar. So we sell our sugar to high-end chocolate manufacturers in the US, in the UK, and the Caribbean, and they put our little stamp saying made with genuine Barbados cane sugar plantation reserve. It helps them because they have an ethical story to say they're helping the Barbados sugar industry, and it helps us by giving us a lot more awareness from a consumer point of view. And then, of course, and there's a picture there of Kerry Ann, who's our production and packing manager, and who also deals with quality control, who's awesome. She loves painting stuff at the factory. So everything in the factory is bright pink, bright yellow, bright blue. It's cheered things up a lot. And we've linked all of this into the tourism experience, because we're not just selling a product, we're selling the island. So we tie in with the Barbados Tourism Authority where we can in terms of promotions, and we see the brand as an extension of tourism marketing. And I think that's critically important for any sort of branding that you do. You do tie-ups with Virgin Atlantic, you do tie-ups with hotels, you look at every single bag of sugar or every banana or whatever it might be on the shelf overseas as an opportunity to promote your country as a destination. Critically important. Finally, you also need to move to change to meet consumer and market needs. We started off in the bottom left-hand corner with a beautiful, beautiful sort of silver tin of sugar. That's how we launched in 2008. Well, 2006-ish, but we didn't get to market till just at the beginning of 2008. And it was great. Everyone loved it. We were in Selfridges, in Harrods, in Fortnum and Mason, in every premium store you could think of. We got amazing media coverage. And it didn't sell enough. It was very expensive. And it was very beautiful. And it didn't help the industry because it was too niche. And that's the other thing we learned, is that it's great to have a beautiful niche product, which everyone loves, but if you don't sell enough to make sure that farmers can get rid of everything that they produce, it's useless. So we changed to a much sort of cheaper, much more cheerful sort of portfolio of products. And then very recently, when we entered the US market, we've changed to the products on the right, which is a much more Caribbean vibe, and which we're rolling out around our group of companies. And it's been very, very successful. But you constantly have to change depending on your objectives and on consumer needs and on market forces. And finally, just an illustration of what that means. And what that means is that we pay, on average, $780 per ton for the sugar that we buy. We can do that because we have a short supply chain, we sell direct to retailers, and because we brand our product. If you sit in front of a Tesco or Aldi buyer, or even a Massey buyer with a bag of sugar or a bag of anything in a clear plastic bag, they will pay you the world price for that sugar, which currently is around $300 a ton. It's nothing. If you come with a story, and you come with a supply chain, and you come with a promotional mechanism, and you know what you're doing, they'll pay you $1,000 a ton. And we pay the Barbados industry between $700 and $1,200 per ton for the sugar we buy, which is between 2 and 4 times the world price, depending on the market, because some markets are more price sensitive than others. And that equates to $2.5 million a year in added value to the industry. So that's just an example of how you can do it. It's difficult, it's risky, it's very difficult. It's taken us 10 years to get to this point. We almost went bankrupt twice, but it works. And just to sort of finish off, I just wanted to illustrate this a little further with a few more examples of how we do this and have done this in small island states, primarily in the Caribbean. The first thing is that we use a structured process. It's modeled on the same process that any fast-moving consumer good company, Kellogg's, Unilever, Procter & Gamble, would use to create and launch a brand. And what you'll probably notice is most of it isn't about branding. Most of it is about supply chain, financing, really dull, all the dull stuff, which I really don't like, but which is critically important to actually selling stuff and making money. If you don't get that right, you fail. So the branding bit is very, very important. If you get that wrong, that's no good either. But what we've learned is that, you know, a nice brand doesn't do it. If you don't have the right pricing, you don't have incredible attention to detail, and if you don't have those skills, you hire them always. And if you don't have outstanding execution, you will fail, guaranteed. And in order to make sure you don't fail, and 75% of new brands do fail, you go through a very structured process. You make sure you do consumer research, you make sure you have good people. If you don't have the expertise, you outsource it. And you make sure that it works. And if it doesn't work first time, you do it again, and you make sure it works second time. A couple of examples. We worked with the largest sweet potato grower in Barbados, who had sweet potato fries, but couldn't sell them in the market. So we created very, very simple packaging, made sure that the size of the pack worked from a price point perspective, because this is in freezers in supermarkets, and they were as with everything in the Caribbean, they were competing against imports. So you're competing against Canadian and US imports, which are much cheaper than anything you can produce in the Caribbean, and generally worse quality. They've been stuck in a reefer for the last sort of 3 months, and so what we did was to make sure that the Sunbury Harvest, the company in Barbados, did simple things like have packaging that stood out, that had packaging which met the specifications of the supermarkets, had price points that worked against the Canadian and US imports, used their vans for free marketing and advertising, and their sales went up 338% just by doing some very, very basic things. Hiring merchandisers. Merchandisers make sure your product's on shelf all the time in supermarkets. It costs money, but if you don't have them, somebody else will have a merchandiser and they'll make sure that their product is on shelf. You have to have good relationships with buyers, all of these things. Basic category management was critical, but very successful. In Fiji, which in some ways is rather similar to Dominica, two of my favorite islands in the world are Dominica and Fiji. Again, we've worked with their government for a while, creating a Sugars of Fiji range, in that case for export to New Zealand. And I say similar to Dominica because a lot of the Fiji Islands are volcanic, just amazing. If anyone ever gets a chance to go, definitely go, just unbelievable. You don't recognize 90% of the fruit and vegetables there, it's brilliant. So we talked about pure sugar from pure nature. It was all about the purity of the water, the earth, the skies, and that's been highly successful. So that is now in New Zealand supermarkets and around the Pacific. And we launched that at the end of 2019 with the Prime Minister of Fiji. And one thing which I would say about branding, product branding on a national stage, is if you see the farmers at the bottom there, it really helps to get everyone from the farm to the processing facilities all the way through to the shipping, the guys in shipping behind it. It builds branding, builds excitement. It gets people behind products and it gets people behind countries. And it's highly successful. And finally, and I'll wrap up in a second, is this, we had a look at Dominica and worked with Dexia about just before the hurricane, 2017, to look at how we could develop regional markets for Dominica fresh produce. And we looked at this really as a test into Barbados. And the reason we did that was lots of people lots of organizations look to export to the US and Europe. It's got prestige, it sounds great. In reality, it's the last thing you need to do until the regional market is satisfied. Exporting to the US and the EU is difficult, it is incredibly expensive. Walking to a supermarket and getting your stuff listed, you generally have to pay listing fees, you have to make sure you have 4 promotions a year, etc., etc. Regional markets are much easier, tend to be more profitable. So, and to illustrate that, bananas in Barbados tend to cost $2 a kilo. Around, I think it's $2 a kilo. In the UK, it's $1. So you get double the price in a market much closer to you, and it allows Barbados to substitute fabulous Dominican bananas for incredibly poor quality imports from the US. And so we did a bit of a test until everything stopped, and sent 2 or 3 containers, I believe, I think there's anyone from Dexia, they'll remind me, to Barbados, which was great as a way of trialing the model, but then of course everything stopped. And we were based the brand, because it worked well in the Caribbean, around the fact there's, Dominica has more centenarians than anywhere else in the world. And so the whole eat well, live young idea resonated, which is great fun. And then, as I said, that sort of stopped over time. But it just shows the sort of things you can do with produce. So finally, I think if we're doing branding, and I thought it was great that Minister Douglas mentioned that he wanted some practical solutions and no reports. I'm sort of allergic to reports. But I think the one thing I would say is if we're doing branding, we need to take branding seriously, and that means investment, and that means understanding that it's a sort of long-term solution, and there's structural disadvantages that Dominica has in common with other small island developing states, but also incredible positives, which have been mentioned before. The heritage, quality, history, people. It's an amazing story. It's fabulous produce, but it requires investment for consistency and quality. Expertise is required, buy it in if you need to, for category management, distribution, marketing. Regional markets need to be first, followed by other exports. And then investments and partnerships are critical, which means an awful lot of investment. And I think that the final thing I'd say is it takes a long time and it costs an awful lot of money to do this properly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. I didn't like that last sentence of yours. Seriously, I have two major takeaways. The first is I never want to meet a buyer from Walmart. But secondly, let me just be clear, Dominican water is better than Fijian water. So that's all down to branding. No, seriously, look, I imagine I'm not the only person jumping up and down, literally jumping up and down in my seat, because what you present so eloquently and so calmly about the potential and the capture of that potential in Barbados is truly inspirational. So that's taken us from the global to the regional and provided some really tangible competition, I'd have to say, for Dominica to step up. And I personally am fairly impatient when it comes to seeing potential not actualized. And again, it's not that Dominica is not doing really incredible stuff. It's just that we've remained quite cottage. And I think that means that every entrepreneur has to struggle to find their own market, and therefore having that umbrella brand is quite, is frankly critical. And I see a point did come up in the comments about Nature Island Naturals, and we can have a discussion after our third presentation about what this could all look like and how we are going to make it happen. But one thing that strikes me in terms of what you've done, again, taking a value chain approach and extending outside of the production of sugar and then the branding of sugar, is the ecosystem around it. So, tourism and, marketing to Virgin Atlantic, etc. Look, we've been shouting and screaming about this at Creed for the Bay oil sector. Dominican Bay oil, which we understand farmers receive 120 EC dollars per pound, Nadia, or per liter. In any event, it's a fairly insignificant amount, and it translates to about between 50 and 100 US dollars per liter. That is wholesaled out of the country, and we don't know really what happens to it. It goes into perfumes, one drop of perfume, and the price explodes. If you go on Amazon.com, not now, after the session, 10 milliliters of bay oil costs 10 US dollars. That means $1 per milliliter. That means 1,000 US dollars per liter. Compare that to $50 to $100. Now, I don't care how much we pay in transport, and I've said this again to others. Maybe the transport costs would take us from 50 or 100 US dollars to $200. Then maybe there's a bit of additional processing and 2 or 3 middlemen, but 1,000 US dollars, that's tenfold. Between 10 and 20-fold we're losing by wholesaling this nameless, faceless thing in a vat that goes on a ship. And again, that's one example, but take the example of, sugar, stretch that to lavender in France. You go to parts of France that sell lavender, there's lavender everything, lavender in pillowcases, lavender in your cup of tea, lavender flavored water. You know, the potential to do bay oil muffins, to do coffee shops around bay oil, to basically provide not even community tourism. Community is almost narrowing it down, provide an entire experience around bay oil or around moringa or around, you know, ginger. You don't just have to export ginger. The properties of these products, as we will talk about in a minute around nutraceuticals, are incredible. And then one last thing I'll say is that, I mean, honestly, Dominica has an even bigger story. And again, it's not that we're better than the next country, but it's natural, there's wellness, but the resilience agenda, I think is really quite unique. And that's something that Dominica has branded itself, right? Dominica came up with the vision of becoming the world's first resilient nation. So how this intercropping of certain varieties of trees, you know, how this ties into the resilience, not just of the soil, but of the communities and of the history and traditions of communities. So long and short, we need to move on to the next speaker, but I think I could listen to, you know, Rob, Candace, and Chris talk for hours. Let's perhaps, let's see if we have any urgent questions. Karen, could you just help me filter through if there's anything critical that we need to pull in right now?
No, I don't think so, Pep. I think that we can save until the Q&A section and just move on to Rob and Candace.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Back to Rob and Candace. Let's dive deep into nutraceuticals.
Great, thank you, Pep. Chris, great presentation, super interesting. And I think, you know, it grounds the discussion in brand, because you can't think about brand without understanding supply chain. They go together, and you demonstrated that quite effectively. I think there's maybe a few distinctions between some of the brands that you've been developing and some of the challenges you've had with sort of commodities and sort of the types of brands that we're thinking about in the nutraceutical industry, and the ability for us to actually push further and forward in terms of pricing and margin, et cetera. So it's a very interesting baseline for this particular discussion. I think what's important for us to understand is that first and foremost, countries are brands. And I think that if we move to the next slide, Candace, I think it's important for us to really understand this, that a country of origin brand has a massive and powerful effect on the exports of those brands. And Chris alluded to some of that with Barbados Sugar and some of the other products that they branded and circulated around the world. I think it's interesting to understand that, you know, what countries stand for tend to, you know, project how someone would intuitively think about buying certain types of products. You know, they talk about country of origin effect as referring to the practice of marketers and consumers associating brands with countries and making buying decisions made on the country of origin of the product. So as we think of countries, for example, like Switzerland, you know, what does Switzerland represent? It's definitely a heritage of precision, and therefore you have a very, very powerful watch and clock industry that's very much tied to Switzerland. It's also, you know, the Swiss Army knife or the chocolate industry tied to sort of an understanding of the landscape and the agricultural industry. You know, you have places like Japan, which are known to be quite technologically savvy and advanced. And because of that, we have this predisposition to understanding the power of brands that come out of that country as they relate to the car industry or the electronics industry. And even countries like India, for example, you know, which has a really strong heritage in food and culture and color even. Countries like that, we're sort of predisposed to buy products like spices and teas or textiles and things like that. And I think it's an important understanding for us to have, because as we think about Dominica and the opportunity for export brands to succeed, we should think a little bit about the associations that people will be making between the exports and the products and the ethos of the country itself.
So if we move to, so here, for example, we said, you know, the reason why people might be buying a watch from Switzerland, for example, is based on two important things. Number one, great export brands borrow and leverage the heritage of the country of origin to market products with a very special narrative and spirit. And number two, not only they do that, but they also develop powerful product branding and storytelling to become great super brands. So let's look at, quickly 2 Caribbean mega brands. So number one is Cohiba brand, the cigars, which we all know. What they do is that they borrow from Cuba elements of mystique, a spirit of revolution, masculinity, and so on. But on top of that, they're also able to layer their own story as a brand and their own storytelling. And a fun fact actually is that the Cohiba brand was created originally as Havana's premier brand for diplomatic purposes. So the tie between the two is extremely close and important. Another example, which we're all very familiar with, is Corona beer and Mexico. So again, Corona borrows from Mexico the spirit of the party, celebration, social gatherings, but added on top of that its own stories, capturing the imagination of people by offering this sense of escape and this famous tagline, "Find your own beach." So here's an example of that feedback loop where country of origin branding supports exports, but exports also reinforce the country of origin brand. So let's take a look at an example with France. And I'm a little bit biased because this is my country of origin, but France stands for culture, luxury, gastronomy, heritage, artistry. And France has a number of great export brands across different industries that internationally promote this positioning. So we have in mind, top of mind Chanel, Dom Pérignon, the Champagne, Cosmeti, Cartier, and so on. Consumers are interacting with all of these export brands, and they start to develop an intuitive understanding of what the country is all about, which means that perceptions about the countries are reinforced. So it creates, on the one hand, opportunities for new brands to come out of that market, and it is also a marketing tool for increased tourism and investment as well. So you've got country of origin, exports, tourism, and investment. Rob, you're on mute, I believe.
Sorry, I think I'm off mute now. Sorry. Let's talk a little bit about Dominica's premium nutraceutical sector, based on what we just sort of uncovered about, country of origin brands and export brands. And by the way, all export brands don't need to be associated with country, but we're thinking that there is an opportunity to combine both, and it's sometimes a little bit easier. And if you flip to the next slide, we can see that, there are 2 really interesting and even shorter term opportunities for Dominica. One is to create an extremely powerful country of origin brand, one that's known around the world and that supports key industries. We're all frustrated by the fact that no one seems to know about this wonderful jewel in the Caribbean, but there is an opportunity based on what it stands for to do something very, very powerful today. The other element is that this Dominica country of origin brand and what it represents and what it stands for does need to start informing the export sectors, the tourism sectors, the investment sectors, because if there's an aligned messaging and narrative that will be tailored to the various sectors, it just reinforces everything. All these elements are completely related, as we've seen. The country of origin brand reinforces the export brand reinforces the country of origin and leads potentially to tourism and investment and the rest of it. So it's all about getting the message out in surround sound to the world. And the second piece is really to focus on a category or a sector rather, that already speaks to the richness and diversity of Dominica, because the point is not to try and develop a sector or product brands that have nothing to do with what people are going to generally understand about Dominica in the first place. So why a premium nutraceutical sector as a focus? Well, a premium nutraceutical industry really leads us to a place where we already have a very competitive advantage in high value and globally in demand sector. So if you look at what this, what Dominica represents and what Dominica has to offer, this bounty, these natural resources, this Eden, if you will, a progressive spirit, which is tied to the vision of the country, which is so powerful today. This is like, just speaking from the point of view of brands, everyone's trying to position themselves as being progressive and modern in their thinking about reinvention and resilient and the rest of that. And this best kept secret, it's rare. This rarity is very important, and it really, these things play up to what the industry, the nutraceutical industry and consumers are actually looking to buy. And for that reason, and other reasons, which we can discuss on the next slide, it seems to be a very interesting industry to start developing. So further rationales for a premium nutraceutical industry. Well, there's trends that we're constantly monitoring for our clients in the beauty sector and in the wellness sector, and it really points to tremendous growth. So you're gonna get a massive pull in this space anyways, particularly post-COVID. There's some very interesting, very interesting anecdotes that actually Pep brought to our attention about our own First Lady, if you will, so the wife of Prime Minister Trudeau, who was asking to source specifically certain nutraceuticals from Dominica to help her recover from COVID. But now as we move into a world of sort of radical wellness, there's going to be incredible pull. So great to be in a market where there's huge demand and people are, a little bit less price sensitive when it comes to quality. It also allows to manage scale and seasonability, which is a really important thing. In this particular case, we don't necessarily have the infrastructure to go large and wide and democratic. So keeping things niche and high value and focused is a very interesting strategic move. It also allows for greater margins, as we discussed, and as Pep alluded to before, dramatically greater margins, which gives us freedom to build these industries and build them properly over time, and also reach out to regions that extend beyond the Caribbean. It also allows us to tell more curated stories of provenance. And this is something of tremendous importance to consumers today. They're all looking to not just buy the product, but they want to buy into the product. They want to understand where the product comes from. So there's this whole new movement away from consumption to actually contribution. People want to contribute through their purchasing and through their buying behavior. Sorry, I just have to plug in before I lose power and lose all of you. So building the framework for all of this, and I think that this is an interesting way for us to launch into a discussion. We talked a bit about the Dominica country of origin brand and how that could potentially help with export brands, but we feel there's an opportunity to actually brand the nutraceutical sector in essence. And it really starts with the same approach as we discussed early on in terms of how you build a brand. So starting with the brand essence of the Dominica premium nutraceutical sector, the brand strategy, how is it positioned globally? What's its vision? What's its raison d'etre? What's its promise? What does this sector stand for? There's quality, there's rarity, but reinvestment in local communities. All these stories, all this value is sort of locked up, and there's an opportunity to unlock it. From there, you move into brand identity. Candice mocked something up on the top of the slide, just like in about 5 minutes, but just to give a sense for, some sort of brand identity, some sort of label that can speak to Dominica, but also specifically to this industry. So a logo design, some taglines, etc., just to help brand that. But I think as important as brand essence and brand identity is sector development and support. You can't just launch a brand without the industry being able and capable and willing to take advantage of the opportunities, but they need help. Individual brands can't get their stories out on their own about the quality and nature of the nutraceutical sector. And so they require support, a concentrated effort. And so in this regard, we see things like, as an example, and this is a non-exhaustive list, a web portal. So helping to define the sector, different ways for different types of people to engage with the sector, where they want to buy raw materials, where they want to buy brands, where they want to invest, etc. Marketing, the sector needs to be marketed. We need to think about trade shows. We need to think about social media strategies, PR, press strategies, and possibly even a communications campaign of some sort. I receive actually on a daily basis a nutraceutical newsletter, and it's a whole industry that talks about the latest and greatest in the nutraceutical industry. I mean, Dominica needs to be represented there and represented frequently. And then I think the last part, speaks to this idea of education. When we see some of the brands that have left Fiji, for example, we talked about Fiji water before in Chris's presentation. The interesting thing is that this was not just a bottle of water that just said Fiji and put a stamp on it. These people had a very savvy approach to bringing that brand to market. There was profound storytelling, connection with the local environment, a very savvy marketing approach in terms of going after high-end chefs and positioning their product around the world as a luxury item. So I think branding and go-to-market learning for local producers and investing in that, I think, is critical as well. We talked about Cohiba before, or Corona before. I mean, these are powerful, powerful brands. And again, that's quite a few horizons away, but understanding the basics of building a brand is critical. And then, scalability, education as well. And I think, Pep and Chris and a number of people have talked about that, but this idea of being able to scale to meet demand. If you're not able to meet the demand, then your brand dies along with it, unfortunately. And then finally, really thinking about the nutraceuticals portfolio. What are the product categories that we think are most likely to succeed and break through? What are the local brands to include and go to market with? And I think the interesting thing about this framework is that it provides, and it's a non-exhaustive framework, but I think it provides a case that can be applied to other industries and other sectors as well. And I think sometimes it's easier to start small and do it well than to start really big or compete with everybody in the world. I think at this particular point in time, based on Dominica's its spirit, its ethos, what it stands for in the world today, and its rare access to these incredible ingredients, and also a budding industry as well in the nutraceutical space, it's positioned for the potential for very, very interesting growth. And I think, if you go to the next slide, I think what we'd love to see is this, this dynamic where you have retailers and I think Chris alluded to these big players squeezing and being difficult to deal with, but I think we should think big as well. And I think there is an opportunity to build big super brands out of Dominica. It may not be the first iteration, but over time, our objective should be that. And where these big retailers globally will be looking for finished brands, finished products, and buying them. And then on the other side of the equation, we have specialty cosmetics companies that are looking for just the highest quality and the most unique ingredients and elements to include in their formulations. So there's a sourcing of local manufacturing as well.
Yeah. And I think just to add, like, this is exactly the same point that Pep, you were making about lavender in France. Like, this is totally it. On the one hand, is really marketing the product to the world, but also market it to those potential buyers to buy the raw materials, and really creating awareness around and recognition around that sector.
So we wanted to conclude and keep the presentation pretty tight because we thought this is a great opportunity to have a bunch of really interesting minds around this idea and branding Dominica and branding a particular sector. But just as a means of concluding, a few key ideas. First, there is an opportunity for Dominica to develop its country of origin brand and market to the world. I think there is a strong possibility that it transcends and breaks through. It needs to be done deliberately, but it's there for the taking. I think number two, the country of origin brand needs to align and inform its various industries to create synergy. It needs to align with the tourism brand, the export brands, investments, all the other industries that have an impact on the socioeconomic health of the country. It's important that, because these are the things that sort of, through a synergistic process, help to reinforce each other, and we can't think of them in silos. Third, the nutraceutical sector itself is positioned well for exports. It's a high growth and high value market, which I think offers us opportunities perhaps that we didn't have in the past, and I think the time is ripe. Fourth, I think branding the sector is important also, so that B2B and B2C recognize and understand its value. We need to make sure that people understand its value. Individual brands going at it alone right now, it's going to be hard to translate that on their own. And then finally, I think the nutraceutical brand or sector needs to create a business support mechanism for educating and communicating and marketing the sector and its brands and manufacturers. And I think we'll end there and pass it back to Pep, and we can have a discussion on based on some of the things that we discussed today.
Thank you very much, Candice and Rob, for the third presentation, which I think ties really nicely into what Chris had spoken about just before. I think Dominica is brimming with potential. I think we now need to figure out how we're going to capture it. So I'm just going to go through some of the comments, and Karen, please feel free, because I'm scrolling up at the same time to see if any of the earlier ones have questions in them. Right.
I would go from here. This is from Sonia, and she had a question. I would be very interested to hear about the target audience for this branding and exporting of Dominican products. What can you share from the market research and audience segmentation? Are we branding for health conscious, quote unquote, superfood seeking retailers and customers in the US? Or the Caribbean/Dominican diaspora, or regional retailers looking for high quality, or someone else? And I believe this question came in during Chris's presentation, so I believe it's directed to Chris.
Well, yeah, thank you. We haven't carried out any consumer research, but my assumption would be it very much depends on the product. So, you know, if you're talking about the country of origin brand, I think that's something, an umbrella brand which you hang. From what I understood from the previous presentation, that's something you hang everything else off. And very much dependent on, I would say fresh produce is probably a regional opportunity. When it comes to nutraceuticals, absolutely, there will be some regional demand, but my expectation would be that that would be primarily US. But the other guys may have a different perspective. And that is all, but I think everything has to be health, or at least I think there needs to be an element of nature, of health, of organic, of X, Y, and Z. It's, you know, it chimes with times, and it makes sense in terms of what Dominica produces, and it's a point of difference.
Rob and Candice, anything to add?
Yeah, I would add something to that as well. I think that, you know, when you go about a project like this, particularly as we're referring to the nutraceutical industry, it's important, and Candice discussed it in terms of the brand architecture, is really understanding customer archetypes. And there's not just one type of customer that will be attracted to this type of offering. There's numerous customers. There'll be the wellness seekers for sure. There will be purpose-driven consumers, people who want to buy into the story of Dominica to a certain extent. There's a strong army of these people that is growing by the day. So there's a lot of different ways of thinking about consumer segments. Obviously, they're going to want to be consumers who are less sensitive about price, because presumably this is not going to be an industry that you compete on price specifically, but on quality and rarity as well. So I think it does sort of self-select certain customers. And I think as you start building this out, a key piece is starting to archetype all of these types of people. So we're understanding exactly who we're speaking to, but also the way that we want to speak to them, because what's going to interest, for example, a purpose-driven consumer may not be the exact same thing that interests a wellness seeker. And so there's a, you know, it's a bit more of a formal approach to sort of dividing and conquering and understanding your customers. I'm talking about B2C, not necessarily stores or aggregators. I think also, as Chris mentioned, and I agree with it, I think that this has a stronger opportunity even outside of the region for a number of reasons, actually. And I think that, as we mentioned before, there's a strong appetite for this right now around the world, around the US, around Europe, and even in Asia. You know, supply chain complexities aside, just in principle, there's some very, very strong market opportunities in addition to the Caribbean region.
Thank you so much, Rob. Pep, I'm going to go down from the top to the bottom. Is that okay?
Yes, please do. And while you're reading through, because I know it's hard to read through and summarize, I was summarizing a couple of other questions in between, so you could focus a little lower down. There are a couple of questions that are following a similar thread. One relates to organic Dominica and the responsibility behind that. I think that came in from Dr. Casimir. Sorry, my screen has now just jumped and I've lost the message. It would be interesting to hear your perspectives on the whole organic agenda. I'm just thinking back to Chris's point on this more sort of targeted branding as opposed to going into the big vacuum that is several hundred different labels that make it hard to distinguish, so country of origin versus organic. And secondly, there is a question here, again, this ties in on Dexia, looking at cocoa and crafts. Does it make sense to brand specific products versus brand, again, the country of origin as a whole? Again, for Chris, Rob, or Candice, please feel free to jump in.
Well, let me just comment on the organic piece, because it's something we've looked at in a similar way to fair trade. Organic is great. There is a significant and growing market for it, particularly in the US. It's certainly larger than fair trade. You see a lot more organic than you do fair trade on shelves. But what we found over the last 3 or 4 years in the US is that it is declining in value. Our sugar in Barbados is not organic, and it hasn't disadvantaged us at all. The reason this isn't organic is we would have serious problems certifying and continuing to certify any products in Barbados other than in a very, very small area as organic. We'd have to turn the entire island organic, which is something we're looking at, because that's a very, and I think that would be great for Dominica in particular. And there is value there, but it is it's difficult. Organic is not a silver bullet for sure, and as I said before, it is absolutely not a substitute for good quality origin branding based on the particularly because there'll be a ton of other products out there, much cheaper products, which will also be organic. So it's good to have, but for me, and I entirely agree with Rob on this one, you need a very strong, very grounded brand based in Dominica to support product differentiation.
I would just add to that, Chris, that in the beauty sector, for example, we spend a lot of time, and also where we're actually formulating some products that we're taking to market ourselves. There is going to be maybe not so much a reliance on the idea of organic, but the idea of clean. And the idea of clean it's a sort of nebulous term because no one really has a firm idea of what that means. There are different retailers like Sephora, for example, that have their clean requirements that we're actually using as a benchmark for our products. But I think that going forward, you'll see a larger concentration of demand for clean. And so as that relates to the way that these products are manufactured, there's not so much a push specifically for fair trade, but we think that there's always, the more elements that you could create around a product that add value, and that could just mean reinvestment in socially into the communities where these things are being developed, supporting farmers, et cetera, in addition to fair trade initiatives, in addition to clean organic initiatives. The more boxes you can tick, the better chance you're going to probably break through with a buyer, because they're being educated right now that everyone's looking for all of these things, and they sort of go, well, I need to tick all these boxes. They can bring it to senior management and say this should have a room for itself on one of our shelves.
Fully agreed. And actually on the organic theme, manufacturers we find are more interested in organic certification than retailers. So supermarkets don't care, manufacturers do, because if you're a manufacturer of organic products, you need an organic ingredient. So from a cosmetics point of view, I'm assuming that organic could be quite important.
Thank you. Karen, did you want to jump in with the next question and I'll follow up?
Sure. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Chris. Question from Lloyd Pascal. I believe we need to stop focusing purely and entirely on the myriad of problems that we face and look at the solutions that are presenting themselves. Dominica has great stories that can be attached to our products. How can we leverage these in practical ways to move our products within markets? I'm throwing that out to the three panelists, and you can, either of you can feel free to jump in with the answer.
Sure, I'll jump in. I mean, I think that I fully agree with the question or the comment. I think that it starts with how you develop the narrative around your brand to a certain extent. There's all these wonderful stories. We need to start leading with them. Candice gave us an example of something we did in high-end cosmetics, for example, where it was all about this idea of maskology and where luxury meets high tech, and it starts positioning it properly, and we start getting into storytelling about that. When it comes to Dominica, there are rich stories. They need to start to be woven into the brand and the brand communications. And again, I think, you know, practically speaking, it is about articulating what the country of origin brand is all about, and that relationship with the export brand to a certain extent, and how they can help each other.
Thank you, Rob. Chris?
Yeah, just one comment on that question. I think it's a very fair point. One of the criticisms which we get quite often is, you know, everyone's writing reports and everyone's talking, but nothing's getting done. And I think there's two ways you can shortcut that, and I think it's becoming easier. The first is you develop something, you try and do it as fast as you can before people lose interest and people pull their money, and you trial it. So instead of doing a massive project which is going to cost you $20 million and is going to be all singing or dancing, you develop something rapidly, you trial it, you put it online, you put it on Amazon.com, you look at price points and you test it. And if it doesn't work, you do something else. And there's a balance between doing a huge national branding strategy and doing something which you can put in market, evaluate, scale up, and if it works, invest in. So for me, it'd be better to do something and get something done than nothing.
Totally. And just to add on that point, and I you know, speed to market is everything. And, you know, totally agree with what you're saying, but I think it doesn't preclude from doing, you know, like that little architecture that we showed in the first presentation, really just thinking about this architecture, who you're targeting, why, what's your positioning, what's going to be different about you, what are you trying to accomplish, who are you as a brand, and so on. Like, all of this really helps you get there even faster. So it doesn't mean that, you know, you're going to get off track and do strategy for months on. You can actually do that, and we do that actually with our clients extremely fast. But it does help you give that compass. And yes, if you have to adjust along the way, sure. But it's kind of like, you know, that due diligence and those foundations that really allow you to think holistically about everything and launch to market or launch actually successfully.
Thank you so much, Rob, Chris, and Candice, for your very thoughtful responses. Much appreciated. Gregor Thomas, I do believe I saw your physical hand in the air, so you can unmute and pose your question.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Badwill. I just wanted to share a few comments with regards to Dexia's own initiative with regards to branding. I also want to use the opportunity to thank Chris and also the Propel project that assisted us in the development of a brand for agricultural products. As you would have seen based on the presentation from Chris, we started, it was some trials that we made through masses, but we had to suspend the operations because there are issues that we need to deal with regards to branding. If we want to do branding successfully, we need to have the consistency in terms of the supplies. And that is one of the challenges that we have That is why we have not even done what we call an official launch of the brand. We are pleased that we have done the development work, but there are things that we need to do, especially from supply side, to ensure that we have consistencies, because it will hurt. I mean, even the work that we have done, if we send products into the marketplace with labels promising certain things and we are not able to deliver. So the investment, some investment is required in that area to assist us to maintain the consistency and reliability, because that is what we are promising when we brand those products. And we also have done work in other areas, looking at Kalinago craft, looking at geographical indications. All of these are areas of branding. But I believe, as Chris was mentioning, that we probably should look at the low-hanging fruits. We have started the development work for agricultural products. We can build on that. But we need to make the investment on the supply side to allow us to maintain the consistency and to give confidence to consumers when they purchase these products.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Gregor. Pep, over to you.
Thank you. Look, I think this is an excellent comment from Dexia. Thank you very much, GM. It's actually a comment that's echoed in a number of the other messages in the group chat. And of course, it's something that we discussed right at the beginning, which is that you have to take a full supply chain perspective from the propagation to the production and the quality control, testing, processing, and financing of the businesses. So this is absolutely critical. I think my only comment, and again, I'm not in the thick of it, I'm an outsider, at least from the CREED angle, is that we do have quite a few opportunities right now to address perhaps supply chain glitches that certainly occurred immediately after Maria and perhaps even before then. We have the World Bank Agricultural Project, which is focusing on propagation and obviously increasing the ability of farmers to produce. Anecdotally, and very anecdotally, I haven't done major data collection, but it does seem that we have quite a bit of crops, particularly tree crops, producing again post Maria. Again, the situation is far from perfect, but I think we're on much more steady ground already production-wise. From the Dominica Bureau of Standards, I hear amazing things about this advanced spectrometer that can do all sorts of quality control and testing. I know that there's real interest from the Ministry of Trade and Commerce in shared manufacturing, likewise from the Ministry of Blue and Green Economy and Agriculture. I'm hoping that there would be interest from Aid Bank as well as from some of the commercial banks to try and find ways to finance small business. Banks are always looking for bankable business. So my hope is that we have the elements, and we might be missing a few, but if we were to line them up and see what do we have in the bag, what needs more work, where is there a glaring gap that's going to require that effort that Chris talks about, right? It's going to cost time and money, and we know that's going to be somewhere on the supply chain. I'm hoping that we can get to a point collectively where we can address some of these issues. But I will just mention from the comments, the issue of labor has come up. Is that
on that from here?
Sorry, I'm not able to see who's talking. Okay, the issue of labor has come up as a key potential constraint in the supply chain. I know that's not something I can bounce to any of our presenters, but without putting either of the ministers on the spot, if there's anyone from the ministry that would like to address concerns on labor, please feel free. Otherwise, we can move on to the next question, but I'll just give you a minute to unmute if you wish.
Well, if I might comment here just briefly, just to alert, it's a matter that the President, His Excellency Charles Savner, raised with me not too long ago. There's some work, a considerable amount of work was done during the last term of the Freedom Party, 1990 to 95, on the entrepreneurial approach to labor. I believe we should examine that among other areas that of potential, because that is a problem that could prevent the objectives of agricultural production expansion being achieved. I have some of the documents. I've made it available to His Excellency, and I'm sure the Minister of Trade would be aware of it also. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Douglas. I'll just pop in with one perhaps related question before handing back to Karen. I'm recognizing that we are approaching the end of the session and we really should have scheduled 50 hours. There is a question around, and this comes in from Iola George, there's a question around internalizing the love for our island and all Dominicans really needing to be part of the solution. So this is a point around collective consciousness that I know is in the National Resilience Development Strategy and is one of the pillars that we believe at CREED will be critical. We will need as an island, as a nation, as a people to walk the talk much more than just, you know, produce products, right? So when people pick up a Dominican product and are as inspired as Chris is to put Dominica and Fiji as, you know, his top favorite islands, and we know that Candace and Rob will be once they land in Dominica, and we're still waiting for them to come. I know that you know, people will want to go to the source of these products, and the last thing you want is to, you know, is to burst the bubble by not having Dominicans collectively treating the island as we wish our visitors to. So I do think that's a very fair point, and thank you for bringing that up, Iola. Karen, back to you.
Sure. Without putting anyone on the spot, but I'm about to, Mr. Pascal from Dexter has raised some very interesting questions and comments in the chat. I see that he's still with us, and I'm wondering, Lloyd, if you would be willing to pose the questions and comments live to the panel. Lloyd? There you
Yes, yes, I'm here. I'm here.
Lloyd,
well,
you're on the spot, in other words.
Sorry about that, Lloyd.
Sorry?
Sorry about that. I really do believe that it would be better live from you.
Oh well, I mean, one of the questions was already dealt with. I think just earlier on, Pep. I think you dealt with one of them, but I think also my GM talked about the Kalinago craft, and which is something that I mentioned as well in terms of some of the work that Dexia has done. But I see that there is a need for us to really, again, put some investment into the whole process, because I think there's need for us to look at how we move forward. And one of the things I'd like to know really is what are the next steps really in terms of moving forward with this initiative? What are some of the things that we need to do? What are some of the things that we need to identify and take advantage of right now as we're talking about this? What are some of the things that we need to do as industry officials, industry people, government, and the various players, the various stakeholders? What are some of the things that we can do right now in moving forward?
Thank you so much, Lloyd. Before I turn over to the panel to address that, I do see that P.S. Thomas has her hand up and has unmuted. So P.S. Thomas, you can continue.
Thank you for the opportunity to make a contribution here. I appreciate the speakers who presented, but I just wanted to indicate that, particularly on the issue of the country of origin brand, Dominica did quite a bit of work on that matter. So foundation is already. I talked about linking the country of origin support to our exports. And I think this is the next step that we needed to have gone. So there's a lot of work on that we did in tourism on the branding of Dominica. And so that could be a next step activity that we probably want to look at. How did we brand the country for tourism, the destination for tourism? What then must we do to link our tourism with our exports so that at least we can have a branded product on the market? And so the opportunity indeed is there for us to continue. And yes, the investment would be required for us to move to the next step on this very important exercise. The Ministry of Trade, you heard my minister, we are in full support of this initiative, and we look forward to continue working with others in this thrust so that at least we can increase our exports with a branded name, logo, and tagline, as well as increasing our foreign exchange. Thank you everyone for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, P.S. Thomas. I will open to the panel. Either one of the three can answer. Lloyd's questions, which was mirrored by P.S. Thomas's question about the next steps forward. And I would hasten to add that without collaboration with my CEO and my learned colleague who is lead on this project on Creed, Nadia, I do believe that a follow-up session is definitely necessary. We are nearing the close of this session and we have over 31 messages and comments and questions that we are going to save and address hopefully in a follow-up session, because it seems absolutely necessary as we chart the way forward in this initiative that we will need several sessions leading up to the full execution of such. But for now, I will let Rob, Chris, and Candice deal with the responses to the last two questions. Thank you.
Chris, I see you're maybe about to speak, but I'll just say that regarding next steps, I'll be happy to cover those. But if there's anything that you wanted to jump in on, please feel free.
The only thing I was going to say, and I'll leave the next steps for people far more qualified than me, is that just in my experience of branding, is that it's quite an emotional process to brand a country, to brand a product from a country. And I think, however it's done, it needs to be a very structured and very evidence-based process, because if it isn't, everyone has a different idea about what a country means, how it should be done, and quite rightly, because it's a very, very, very important thing to get right. And the one thing I would say is, where we've done this before, the best way to take that emotion and turn it into something very positive is to make it do a lot of consumer research, make sure that any position you come up with, whether for a product or a country, reflects both the feelings of everyone who lives in that country, but also the external, how it works in the external market. Does it actually get more products sold? Does it encourage more tourism? Is there a practical benefit to that positioning? That's the only thing I'll say.
Yeah, and if I may add to that, one, like to the idea of like the approach to doing it, because I agree that, you know, it is an emotional process, that's for sure. That's why we have some sort of like a structure to it, but also in the way that we usually do it for our clients or other even regions of the world, is all about the inputs. So the way that we do it, for example, is that we did a whole project in the Caribbean recently where we had the public sector, the private sector at the table. We had youth representatives. We had Aboriginal communities represented as well. We had the academia represented, so that the idea is that we get the inputs from a very diverse set of people and
stakeholders,
so that it really informs everything moving forward. And I think that's really the key here, and especially for a country like Dominica.
I think I would echo that, and essentially the inputs are everything, and a strategic way of aggregating them and then synthesizing them and then reformulating them into something which is intuitive that everyone can understand and get behind is absolutely critical. I'm reading the comments also because I'm just fascinated by them as they're coming in rapid fire, so I'm trying to do a few things at once. But I noticed there is some sentiment about trying to ensure that there is a sort of a fair and efficient supply chain that's organized first. You know, we can't do branding unless we solve for this. And I would just push back on that a little bit to say, first of all, of course, we've all agreed that you can't take a brand to the world successfully without having the supply chain and reinvestment in communities and in producers in an inclusive way, and without having a brand as well. You need both. And so this is a team effort. But I do think that there's an opportunity, and almost to Chris's point in terms of iterating and movement and speed, you know, and to Candice mentioned speed as well, is that, you know, these things are not mutually exclusive. We can work on both of these things at the exact same time. If we wait to get everything perfect from a supply chain point of view, we could be missing our opportunity, particularly in certain segments. We're talking about nutraceutical. It's small, it's niche, it's controllable. scale is not as important as in other industries. There's a huge appetite on the world market for this type of product. Dominica has an incredible story to tell, an incredible ethos, an incredible spirit that could be encapsulated in any brand that's being packaged and launched to the world. And I think that the opportunity to focus on a sector to help support the individual brands at the outset is important and can be done in concert also with thinking about how Dominica comes to the world now with this strong message. These things can happen concurrently. They can support each other. And I think that's probably the way forward. And to a comment that was made just before, I think P.S. Thomas, it was, how do we align the ideas of what Dominica stands for in tourism, which is well developed, in exports, in investment, in other sectors and industries as well. But a very, very interesting discussion. And it's, what I love about it is that there's a lot of passion that I can see in all of in the chat, which means that people care about this, and there's a huge opportunity for us all to do something really constructive and really, really positive.
Thank you very much. Sorry, Chris, were you going to jump in?
No, it's just, there was one comment which said, just do it. So I think reflecting Nike, I think that's exactly what we should do.
Dr. Poon, thank you very much. I think you said it. This is a brilliant start. I'm underlining start. This is not a session or an event. This is a start. Totally agree that focus and niche are key, and absolutely, let's just make this happen. I think we can. There's only so long we can sit on the sidelines of potential. Just a couple of words of wrap up. I mean, firstly, I think this has been an excellent conversation, both from our three presenters and from our colleagues in the chat. But more importantly, I think recognizing that the leadership of the two critical ministries, as well as a key entity, Dexia, and other partners are really kind of rearing to go and already acting in a number of spaces. We'll point to Rob's comment that, we can address things concurrently, and we are already moving in a number of areas. So I think we need to figure out how to fit branding in both as a natural next step for some of the sectors that are producing, again, in nutraceuticals. We have the ginger, we have the turmeric, that's underground, that's being produced by Save-A-Lot, by Nature Farms, by a number of other companies. So the product is there. The question is, how do we get volume? And then I think the second piece is, how do you use this brand as a hook to engage some of our youth and some individuals who maybe see farming or agriculture as old-fashioned, old-school, back-breaking, as opposed to seeing themselves as entrepreneurs and business people, creating a product and not just an input that goes nameless and faceless onto a ship somewhere. Geese boats come to mind. So, I think we also need to use a brand as a way to stimulate our own excitement locally. And not just to stimulate the demand, but to stimulate the supply. So maybe it sits a little bit at that middle point, Chris, of your upside down and right side up pyramid. Look, in terms of next steps, again, this is the beginning. We know that activities are already underway, but from the CREED perspective, working very closely with a number of local partners as well as our international colleagues, we will look at the holistic brand as well as support to the nutraceutical sector as an incubator for a space in which we can start to test and mold the brand around. CREED must be developing a terrible reputation of going painfully over time, which we do consistently on our webinar discussions, but I think that's because the excitement is clear from the audience. So my takeaways to me, Chris, are, yes, this is an emotional space. The process must be extremely structured. In that regard, I think we will be calling on all our speakers to help us guide that process going forward. Secondly, we have mentioned a couple of times, I think Karen has mentioned in the chat, please enter your email addresses. We'll keep the call open for a couple of more minutes after I've finished speaking. Please enter your email addresses because we are about to launch a consultative process. To P.S. Thomas from Ministry of Trade and Commerce, the link to tourism, the link of tourism to exports will be critical, so that will definitely be taken into account. But what we will be doing over the coming months is working towards the development of this umbrella brand, leveraging the knowledge, the expertise, and the excitement of Dominicans and those who wish to help us along our journey. So without
before you close,
before you
close,
Dr. Douglas.
Just a brief addition.
Yeah, I know.
I just wanted to know that the government of Dominica has mandated our Ministry of Trade to formulate a trade policy. So this matter is also when one of your speakers spoke about alignment, the whole alignment of branding and the trade policy is something we would keep in mind. So I anticipate further collaboration with CREED on this particular matter. As the trade policy work evolve, we expect it to be ready for cabinet consideration before Christmas, sometime in December. And so that doesn't give us a lot of time. So the alignment that you spoke about, we anticipate that will be part and parcel of our work. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Douglas. With pleasure. You know how to reach us, and we'll be more than happy to be involved. So thank you for mentioning that.
I would, Doc, good day to everyone. I'd like to make a little comment, please, if I can.
Yes, please.
Okay, very quickly. So Chris Docherty, I would write pronunciation. I'd like to have some more clarity on the differentiation that you made between traditional branding like fair trade versus regional branding, and why the movement from traditional branding to regional branding.
Chris, I think that question was for you from Julian.
Sorry, I didn't quite get the last bit of that question. Why the...
What I'm saying is basically is that I read the comment of the traditional markets and branding of those markets, the fair trade, the loss of value of the product because of competition and other forces, but also the refocusing on the regional market for branding of products, which is about 5 million people in the region.
Right.
I'd like to be some clarity on why the refocus on regional, on traditional branding, which we already have infrastructures. For example, if we're interested in the fish in the market, and for example, we don't have any fish or space in or presence in any one of the regional markets. I just want some clarity on that.
Sure, understood. It's because it's just very, very honestly, it's easier and cheaper and more profitable generally to sell products into the regional market. Currently, the Caribbean imports $6 billion US of food every year. And the big opportunity for the Caribbean is import substitution, not export. Because you're either saving foreign exchange through import substitution or you're creating it through export. Saving, it's easier. You're basically trying to kick out US products, and you can make more money doing that because the quality standards tend to be lower. You don't need ISO 22000 as you do in the US. You need HACCP, which is a much cheaper way of producing products. And typically margins are higher because it's a smaller market. Now, if you have huge volumes, you have to go outside. But for most Caribbean products, the regional market is plenty big enough, and we know it's plenty big enough because we already import $6 billion US a year of food.
Well, just a follow-up note on that, I would like to say that branding is really the end game of the organizational framework for the supply chain, and the establishing the presence in the marketplace. What I'm saying is that we already have infrastructure investment, business investment, for example, in Windfresh, with 25% shares in the company, which has a face in the UK market that is promoting various social brands in the UK. I'm saying that why should we turn away from that and live the region? I'm not saying we should not focus on the region, but why should we turn away from that?
Well, no, I'm not talking about turning away from that. I'm just saying that there is an opportunity in the regional market, just as we do with sugar. We saturated our local Caribbean market with our sugar brand first, and then once we've saturated it, export it to UK and US. I don't think it's an either or. I'm saying that for new brands, it's much easier to start in the regional market and then export once you have a firm base. That's all. It's not you don't have to make a choice.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you so much, Mr. Alwyn. I noticed that Mr. Murray had his hand up for the longest while. We are very over time, but Mr. Murray, if you can make it brief, we are willing to take your question. You are still on mute. I see your lips moving, but we cannot hear you. Okay, Pep, can we, you said someone else had one.
Yes, I think Dr. Casimir had also raised his hand. Dr. Casimir, would you like to jump in?
Yeah. My comment is directed towards Chris. And yes, we understand the process of going forward with a brand, a national image in terms of brand. But for an agrarian-based society like Dominica, I wanted to actually hear his comments with regards to the integral relationship between branding and traceability systems put in place, especially as we delve into the nutraceutical industries, the importance and the issue of traceability, and basically having the systems put in place, i.e. certification systems that would allow the image of the brand to be actually honored and genuine. Because he mentioned something very interesting throughout his presentations, i.e. the whole issue of responsibility behind the branding. And I would like to, if he would so indulge himself and give us some more insights as to that. Thanks.
Wow, that's a large topic. Traceability is huge. It's critical. I mean, in all of our products, we make sure through various mechanisms. We've messed around with blockchain, which actually was an expensive, rather inefficient way of doing traceability. I wouldn't recommend it, but it seemed we needed to test it. But if you're selling a product on origin and you're selling it to a manufacturer on origin, you need a process throughout your supply chain to make sure that you can demonstrate to that buyer that the product is genuinely from where you're saying it is. So, and that's all online. There's a load of tools you can use, and so we use a couple of off-the-shelf tools to demonstrate that to manufacturers in the EU and US, but it is critical. And I could talk about it for 4 hours, but I'm not sure we have time.
No, but I think the point is well taken, right? That this is one of the many issues. And sorry, I didn't mean to cut you, Karen. There are other issues around legal frameworks, again, other issues around labor and supply chain. So I think that we need to look at the full value chain and some of the requirements of buyers to ensure that we're producing the right amount and to the right quality and to other standards. If Mr. Murray is not, I don't see him here. I think, there we go. Mr. Murray, again, I think there's an audio issue because you are unmuted, but we can't hear you.
Okay, Pep, I think
we need to wrap up.
I have noticed that both ministers, Grant and Douglas, have remained till the very end of the session. So if they have any final words, it would be very instrumental to hear from them briefly, and then we can definitely wrap up. Minister Grant, Minister Douglas, any final words?
Not necessarily, just following the discussion. Like I said at the beginning, after this discussion, we need to be able to crystallize those discussions into real practical grassroots implementation. That is what we need. So we need to be able to use all of those ideas to have a better presence, a more dominant presence on the market, because at the end of the day, that's what this is all about. Generating revenue and making a success story, and turning really the potential that we keep saying that we have into real value what I would like to add in conclusion.
Thank you very much, Minister Douglas. Minister Grant, I saw you unmute.
Thanks for having me. It was a lovely discussion. I would really like to see some results. Just to answer, someone raised the question about labor. As it is now, it's something that the ministry is paying close attention to as it relates into the cost per day for manual labor. But most importantly, it's important for us to note that the government is in the process, along with the World Bank, in providing small tools and machinery for farmers. And that is significant because it reduces your cost of labor, which in turn reduces your cost of production. But also there are concessions as it relates to machinery and small tools. And if persons who are on and interested, I think you should have a discussion with the ministry as it relates to the necessary concessions that's available for farm tools, which would reduce your cost of labor. But like I said before, I'm looking forward to the result of this discussion. And thanks again.
Thank you as well, Mr. Grant, and over to you, Pat.
Thank you so much. Ministers, thank you for gracing us with your presence. We hear your message loud and clear. What will come next is action. Thank you again to Chris, to Candice, to Rob for your fantastic presentations. Please know that you're not going anywhere. We're going to be in touch and leveraging you. Thank you to the audience. So in terms of concrete next steps, for everyone who has entered their email address in the chat, and those who haven't, please do so now. You'll be hearing from Nadia Paquette Anselm, the lead on Creed side for agriculture, together with Karen Mahey, our communications lead, who has been helping me to manage the session. They will be reaching out in the coming weeks with information on the next conversation and how that is going to translate into a roadmap for brand development and for supporting the nutraceutical sector. So with that, I thank you all very much for joining in, and we look forward to continued engagement, again, leading towards action in the months ahead. Thanks all. Please stay safe and have a lovely weekend.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Very productive session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.